Ürnic. And I'm sure a number of you already listened Cem here in the past. He's going to talk about Turkish economy again, Turkish political economy and the current crisis. So hopefully he's going to provide us some analysis and some tools to understand what's going on in relation to Turkey's economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Well, okay. So what am I going to speak about today? Just say it actually. There are two things that I will talk about. First of all, I'll show some graphs on what the current situation in Turkey is now. And I will give like a brief history of economic developments in the AKP Just and Development Party era. And we'll discuss why it's the economic downturn happening now. And I have some predictions, let's say, about the impact of economic downturn on the crisis on Sunday. And it's actually based on a new research that we have done too, so I hope you'll find it interesting. Okay, a couple of things. First of all, we are officially in a recession now in Turkey. The definition of recession is two consecutive quarters of contraction in GDP. And when we look at the data that is seasonally adjusted in terms of quarterly GDP, here the blue lines basically show the growth rate compared to the same quarter of the previous year. So how much compared to, let's say, to here last quarter of 2007, there's economic change. And the black line is basically the growth rate compared to the previous quarter. And here we could see that there seems to be a decline in the economic growth starting from the second quarter of 2008, which basically continued on the last two quarters of 2008. So we are in a... 2018. Sorry, 18. So we are officially in a recession. Another graph showing the economic situation in inflation and unemployment rate. Here, the economists basically propose an inverse relationship between inflation rate and unemployment rate. So therefore, I basically put a graph that shows both inflation rate and unemployment rate. Here I basically have taken the non-agricultural unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate, when consider agriculture sector, a lot of the employment in the agricultural sector is subsistence. I feel like the non-agricultural unemployment rate is a better indicator, that's why. And again, the inflation, consumer price inflation and unemployment rate for different periods. For instance, the red line shows the 2008-2009 crisis, but the purple is basically showing, each data point is showing 1 month. And the purple line shows the period starting from 2013 until 2018, which is the last announced data. And you could see that, and these are the months that I indicated, starting from the June of 2018, there seems to be an increase both in terms of unemployment rate and consumer price inflation. Notice that this is earlier than the Trump crisis that Turkey experienced in the middle of 2018. With the Trump crisis here, of course, the inflation rate peaked up because of the massive depreciation of Turkish lira. But the problem started to show itself even before the diplomatic crisis between Turkey and the United States. If we look at this graph through time, the red line is the non-agricultural unemployment rate and the green line is the consumer price inflation. And here I also put one index called misery index that's suggested by a famous American economist, Arthur Ockham, which is basically kind of like adding up apples and oranges but still an indicator showing the economic situation, which is inflation plus unemployment rate. And you could see that starting from the beginning of 2008, there's a massive increase in here. So in terms of consumer price inflation, it has been worse than ever, like if we start the period from 2005. So it's reaching towards levels of 2004, 2003 now. And the non-agricultural unemployment rate is still not very good. It's actually a bit comparable with the time where there was a global economic crisis in 2008, 2009, which Turkey also suffered significantly. Another thing, this is the data that we have until 2018, but what might be happening in the last 3 months, we don't have data on unemployment rate yet, or we don't have growth data on 2019 yet. However, you could see that this is the PMI index on business confidence in manufacturing industry done by Market and Istanbul Chamber of Commerce, which basically is based on surveys that's being done amongst the business people in the manufacturing sector. And usually the scores below 50 is kind of a sign of not positive growth, or you're leaning towards recession. You could see that it's declined significantly in July, August, September, but the last data was announced in February 2019, and still we don't see a significant recovery here, which reflects that the business confidence, at least on February, was not recovered yet. And another data is basically the credit stocks of Turkish banks, the loans totally provided to the firms, which excluding the financial sector. Here we see that this was in Turkish lira terms, but I converted to the US dollar terms to account for the inflation, and there seems to be a decline at the time of diplomatic crisis between Trump and Turkey, but the recovery hasn't been very much yet. The reason is basically the banks now are still hesitant to give credits to the investors because there are still defaults of private enterprises that's ongoing. And also the interest rates are also quite high, and under these economic circumstances the private firms also might not be very much willing to take credits. So this is another sign that goes until now, and this is the latest data that I've taken today from Turkish Republic of Turkey's central bank. And this is the situation. Okay, so this is the current situation in Turkey. What's going on? I mean, why Turkey is experiencing a downturn now? To understand this, maybe to the non-Turk people in here, I might give a little history of Turkey, on what's going on. Starting from, and before 1980, Turkey was adopting more closed economy strategy, like more import substitution, industrialization strategy, and it shifted to the more export-oriented growth model in 1980. And after that, with again Turgut Özal, later the capital markets, the financial markets were liberalized in 1989 too. And as a outcome of the first outcome of that liberalization was in 1994, Turkey experienced an economic crisis. It was actually using a fixed exchange rate along with free capital movements, which later was proved to be a very wrong and unsustainable strategy in developing economies. So Turkey experienced a crisis in 1994 and 2001 too. And by the time that we arrived 2002, People were really fed up with hyperinflation, the consequences of economic crisis, so they wanted to try something new and elected this guy. It was a bit of a little complicated story, of course. He couldn't become MP at first, but later they changed the laws and he became an MP and prime minister after. And he has been ruling Turkey starting from 2002. But in terms of the growth model didn't change significantly in Turkey. Still, the Turkish economy is very much dependent on capital inflows. The difference between 90s and now is there's floating exchange rate regime as opposed to fixed exchange rate regime, but that was something that was brought with the government before Tayyip Erdogan. Okay, there were some reforms that was being made with Ecevit Kemal Dervish government, which later were partially reversed. But Tayyip Erdogan, along with other leaders in developing economies, had something really lucky, which is he was elected right at the period where the Federal Reserve's interest rates, policy rates, and also ECB's, and you could include Bank of Japan, and Bank of England, all big central banks, interest rates were actually low compared to the history. You could see that in 90s, for instance, the Federal Reserve's discount rate was around 5%, which was down at the time that Tayyip Erdogan elected, which was temporarily up, but with quantitative easing policies and low interest rate policy of the Federal Reserve, it was down again, which is slightly increasing now. Why is this important? Because Turkey is a country that consistently gives current account deficit and consistently needs capital. And of course, if you are an economy that's liberal in terms of capital flows, if there is a massive money supply in developed economies, part of that money supply has come to your country, which basically boosted Turkish economy. But it actually not only boosted Turkish economy, other emerging economies also benefited from this capital inflows. Here I put the annual growth of GDP per capita in different country groups. This is not growth in GDP, but rather GDP per capita. And you might notice that until the period that Turkey started to experience economic problems, the lower and upper middle income countries compared to 90s actually experience higher growth rates. So it was a good period for emerging economies, along with Turkey. And similar trend is also experienced in Turkey, which of course is very important for boosting Tayyip Erdogan's popularity, because a regular person in the street wouldn't understand this whole macroeconomic changes in the world economy. What he would see is that he would say, okay, my living conditions has improved. And this is being done with Tayyip Erdogan's policies, which wasn't the case in the 90s, while I was experiencing 100%, 70% inflation rates. And notice that Turkish economy was actually more deregulated in terms of capital inflows than even other emerging economies. And as a consequence of that, at the boom periods, Turkey, like for instance from 2002 to 2007, Turkey experienced higher growth, but the bust periods were more damaging for Turkey. So between, and indeed, Tayyip Erdogan claims that the global economic recession passed Turkey to tangent, didn't affect Turkish economy. This is actually wrong. Turkey is one of the countries that was the most affected from the global economic crisis in 2008, 2009. But what it did was that it recovered fastly too. The recovery was also fast. And when we arrive today, basically before everything started in 2008, the middle of 2008, before the Trump-US Turkey crisis that stimulated the whole downturn in Turkey, Turkey was suffering from three things. One is Turkey had a chronic current account deficit problem in the 2000s. So Turkey was importing more than its exports. So you're basically spending more money than you produce. That's what it means. And when we look at the graph, actually this is the GDP growth, and this is the current account deficit over GDP, and this is the gap between private investment and private savings. The data was available until 2006, so I included until then. As you can see that Turkey, with the exception of the global economic crisis, was giving current account deficit around 5% of its GDP. It's actually massive when you compare it with other developing economies. And mainly, the current account deficit was due to private savings being more than private investments. So the deficit was more in the private sector. The public sector has been, or at least had been, more balanced until now. Now we start to see some deterioration in the public sector too. But whenever, as you might notice, there's a massive growth, it's reflected in the massive current account deficit too. For instance, this is a year like almost over 10% growth according to Turkstat data, which also means like almost 8-9% current account deficit that Turkey gave. Well, the problem is that if you spend more than you produce, you have to find money to be able to do that. You either will start accumulating debt, or you have to sell your assets. How can you consistently consume or spend more than you produce is the question. At some point you will experience a crisis. We'll come back to that. After a point, 2011, Turkey really started to accumulate debt. And we see that the Turkey's gross external debt has increased from 36.7% of its GDP to almost like 52% of its GDP. And it's still increasing, by the way. I mean, the latest data that came out lately shows that in the last quarter, the private sector indebtedness even increased by the end of this last year. And another thing is that Turkey was financing this current account deficit through depleting reserves. Before 2013, the Central Bank of the Republic of Turkey was accumulating reserves, but after 2013, basically we start to see the foreign currency reserves eroding over time, which basically partially financed, if the question is how Turkey was spending more than it was producing, well, one of the reasons in the latest period is eating from foreign currency reserves. And the latest domestic foreign currency reserves is like over $70 billion. This is but gross reserves. The net reserve, because part of this money belongs to the banks, the part that belongs to only Central Bank of Turkey is below $30 billion, which is actually quite small.
Just for the latest information, Financial Times yesterday was mentioning that it is below 25 billion.
Today, I think this week, the chairman of Central Bank basically said it was like 26, including gold reserves. This is basically including gold reserves. So both, if you exclude gold reserve, probably it's below 25%. Yeah, it's $25 billion. Any questions or anything?
Today, Erdogan said our reserves over 100 billion.
Well, I mean, he might be including gold in here, but I would really doubt about that. Maybe with gold barely 100, I think 104 billion maybe. But this number is basically excluding gold reserves. It's only foreign currency reserves. But I mean, the important thing is that there's a like almost over $30 billion decline in the reserve.
So $30 billion they spent.
Yes.
Just in this short period of time.
Yeah, just in like 5 years, let's say. And again, like the massive part of this money is basically the reserves that the banks are keeping in central banks. So it's not even central banks' own money here. So we have, when we look at net reserves, it's below 30 billion.
Yeah, I think the reserves rating in the foreign banks for the better interest. I think 5% interest they are giving some banks in England.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they give they put the money in their bank for a while.
I think there is a regulation that they have to keep some of their reserves it's like there's this reserve option coefficient thing that they're using. But okay, the questions are like, another interesting question is like, okay, we were like spending more than we were producing, but why was, I mean, okay, the private sector was doing investments more than savings, but where was the investments? Where were the investments going?
Into the military? Into the military? Anything?
No, I mean, I didn't include military numbers, but the biggest share of the pie goes to housing investments, so construction. As you can see, there is a significant increase, especially after 2011. The share that goes to housing is significant. So this is basically the construction boom. And transportation, communications, well, you could, probably this also includes investments that are made for third airport. And also all these like new bridges and infrastructure investments, railways. Now, I mean, if the Turkish people here would know really well, but just to explain again, Turkey, Istanbul has been doing a massive third airport, which basically is costing around $10 billion to the consortium that have taken the option and making the airport, building the airport. And they have to pay $1 billion each year to Turkish government, which adds up to $25 billion extra. So it's basically a $35 billion project that we are talking about, which is basically the biggest project that was made in the emerging economies in the latest period. You got a question?
Is it anything to do with the new Silk Road as well? Because if they're investing in transportation and communications, and it's, you say that and they're investing more in export, is it to do with the new Silk Road that's coming from China going into Central Asia? You know, and is Turkey trying to invest more in receiving goods from the East?
I think the aim is not that. The aim is two things, I think. One is of course populism, I would say, to earn more votes by showing that I've done this, I've done, by showing all these massive projects. The other is creating an economic activity. Because they basically are used to the period where there was massive capital inflows coming, and construction investments has always been an important push for creating an economic activity while there's a supply of money that was flowing to Turkey. And this third airport, I think, is a part of the project of creating a third Istanbul, because they are building a third bridge, and they want to build a new canal Istanbul, in a similar area, and like just expand Istanbul towards north, which would create a significant economic activity and push the Turkish
economy.
economy.
To tell more about Canal Istanbul, it's a parallel of Bosphorus,
Yeah.
They need to invest millions of dollars.
Yeah, that's also a project that's super expensive. Probably it won't be realized, at least in the near future, because they're talking about a project that worth like $25 billion at least, which in this global economic conjuncture, I don't think that's going to be possible to find this money.
What's unusual about that? If there's high unemployment, does that mean you need to be employed to be able to build all these infrastructure and the airports? So where's all the work coming from? Is he using workers outside Turkey?
No. I mean, it's generating employment for mostly for the Turkish workers. The problem is the following: the investments, the money that's basically going rather than industrial sector or more towards the sectors that are IT related or technology related, it's going to construction. What this does is that construction projects usually generate one-time value. Okay, in the airport case, the aim is making Istanbul one of the hubs of the airline traffic. But I don't know whether that will be true or they will succeed on that. I would put a question mark on that. And other bridges that the building was made with the following formula, just to explain you. Well, they basically outsourced the whole project to a private firm. And they put a cap of, let's say, they are making a bridge, and you put a cap of the number of cars that will pass through that bridge. Well, the problem here is that cap, the number that we have as the cap, has never been realized. So if the number of cars that passes from the bridge is much below, the rest of the money is basically financed by the government itself. So you basically put a goal of saying, okay, I will make this extra bridge and generate these extra revenues. But what's really happening is that the government, the bridge is not generating these revenues. So it's basically kind of like it's actually way below what was proposed. So it's one, generating budget deficit for you over the long run. The other is, I mean, as an economist, I would prefer to see money flow into the projects that would generate technology and that would help in the near future close this current account deficit by making Turkey produce high value added products rather than money flowing to construction investments. Was I?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. The question that I would like to ask here is that why Turkey is facing the economic downturn now? Because we've shown that Turkey has been given current account deficits all the time, except the global economic crisis. What's the problem now? How Turkey sustained these current account deficits for a long time? Well, I basically divided Turkish economy into 4 periods. One is until the global economic crisis, 2003 to the third quarter of 2008. Well, in this period, Turkey was basically financing, or the better way of saying this is that could import more than its exports because of the money flows coming to the country. And these money flows, with the current Turkey's EU candidacy at the time, and also the positive environment about Turkey in the global markets, and also the excessive money supply in the global markets, the money was coming in the form of foreign direct investments, a significant part of the money. Indeed, I put the shares of FDI, foreign direct investments, and financial portfolio investments. Foreign portfolio investments are in blue, and the foreign direct investments are in red. The difference between two is that the foreign direct investments are basically money coming to make real economic activities in Turkey. It could be buying a company in Turkey or just putting up a new factory in Turkey. This is red. And the blue one is the money that's coming in form of buying stocks in the stock exchange or buying bonds. Is listed as blue, and the rest is credits or changing reserves. As you can see, the first period was good in terms of foreign direct investments. But I would still put a question mark to that, because the foreign direct investments were coming, a lot of them were coming in form of privatizations of public firms. Like we see Turkish Telecom sold with a good price at the time, or Petkim, which is an oil refinery, sold at a good money. The Tekel, which was the public cigarette and alcoholic drinks company. And all these companies were privatized to foreign firms. Another company, Tüpraş, for instance, was bought by a Turkish company, but it had firm partner Shell, which I think had like 15 or 20% of the shares. So a lot of these foreign direct investments is basically coming in form of selling the Turkish companies. There was also foreign portfolio investments, money flowing to the Turkish stock exchange markets and bonds markets due to the low interest rates in the US and relatively lax capital account regulations in Turkey. So this is the first period. In the next period, Turkey experienced global crisis, and as I've shown in the table 2, Turkey actually experienced a very negative growth at the time of the global crisis, and the reason is that since the investments in Turkey are very much dependent, because there isn't enough savings in Turkey to keep up with those investments, so the investments were very much dependent on the capital coming from abroad, and when that stopped, then the investments stopped, which basically is reflected in the negative growth rates in Turkey. We see, for instance, foreign direct investments reduced by almost 60% in 2000. And the next period until 2003, the 13, sorry for that, is basically the period of financial inflows due to the quantitative easing policy of Fed. But this time the money that's flowing to Turkey is basically coming more in the form of portfolio investments rather than foreign direct investments. Why was this the case? Well, first of all, one reason is obviously privatizing the public enterprises is not a sustainable strategy. At some point, the amount of privatizations that you could make will finish. The second is, of course, people in the foreign market started to see slowly the risks in Turkey. Turkey's shining stars started to just a bit slow down. The perception on Turkey has changed too. And the next period after 2013, this is 2014 I would say, there's a typo in here, to the second quarter of 2018 where the economic downturn started. As you can see, both foreign portfolio investments and foreign direct investments as a share of current account deficits was down. How was Turkey financing its current account deficit then? Well, rising debt, and mainly in the private sector, is one thing that helped.
Where are they getting the money from? Where are they borrowing it from?
From mainly the European banks, especially banks, Spanish and Italian banks like UniCredit or BNP Paribas. And indeed, it's very funny that when the downturn started, BNP Paribas, for instance, CEO came to Turkey to speak with Tayyip Erdogan, because The fear was that if the Turkish companies start to default, that will also damage the European banks. So the crisis in Turkey will transmit to the Eurozone. That was the fear that the European banks had. Because Italian banks already are in trouble for the last few years. People are talking about the problems of the Italian banking system, so they wouldn't want to see extra problems coming from Turkey. And as you can see, starting from 2008, especially from 2011, you see the gross external debt as a share of GDP accumulating, mainly due to the private sector, which is one of the reasons why now we see a lot of Turkish companies going into bankruptcy. But
are these debts guaranteed by the government?
This is basically the debt, external debt, as a share of GDP. And this is the debt of government, yes, public sector, as a share of GDP. So this is the government debt. And this is
red one, guaranteed by
the red one is the private sector, yes, as a share of GDP. So as you can see, the problem is mainly in the red one. Yeah.
When a private company borrows money from abroad, mostly they ask for some state guarantees. So isn't it the situation that even these private borrowings are
government responsibility?
Government guaranteed somehow, or is it just the assets?
I'll explain that question, but just to remind you, this is increasing not only in the form that all the companies are going and asking bank for credit at BNP Paribas or other private banks in Europe. It might be the case that the big banks like İş Bankası, Akbank, or other Turkish banks might be getting loans from or Garanti Bankası might be getting loans from European banks and distributing this to the real sector too. So, and in terms of your question, as the fragilities of the private sector started to become slowly apparent, in 2017, Turkish government have done one thing, which is called, they created a fund that's called Credit Guarantee Fund, which public banks participated. I think there's some money of private banks too. What this did is, of course, this is organized by the Turkish government. It provided collaterals to commercial credits that's taken by mainly small and medium enterprises. In Turkish, we call it Credit Garanti Fund. And this actually was important in terms of Turkey kind of recovering from the slow growth in 2016 and experiencing a high growth in 2017. With the cost, because there's a fund that's basically guaranteeing the money that's given to the small and medium enterprises. But of course, with the cost of indebtedness in the private sector jumping, which immediately increased the fragilities even further. So that project of putting a fund, guarantee of a fund, wasn't a very smart idea. It just basically created an unsustainable boom that later Turkey paid in the next year. And another question? And another thing that also supported the boom is that Erdogan's obsession about keeping the interest policy rates of Turkish Central Bank. He basically has an idea that higher interest rates basically push higher inflation in Turkey, which basically probably cannot be true. It's not mainstream at all, what he's saying. And it probably can't be true for Turkey because lowering interest rates would lead to significant depreciation of Turkish lira, and the inflation rate in Turkey is very much dependent on depreciation of Turkish lira. So if you impose a policy that would lead to a significant depreciation of Turkish lira, that means you're pushing the prices up, as the production in Turkey, even in agricultural production, is very much dependent on the imported goods, inputs. And just to remind you, the current account deficit in Turkey is basically happening not due to imported goods that are coming in terms of consumption goods. This current account deficit is basically mainly given due to intermediate and capital goods. So the goods that you need to make production, because the whole industrial structure of Turkish industry is very much dependent on the imported goods. So, okay, before finishing, I would like to mention a little about, last point is that another thing, as I said, that helped Turkey to finance this current account deficits was basically depleting the foreign currency reserves. But what happened in the end then, by the time that we reached mid-2018, Turkey was a country with high external private debt, which wasn't sustainable, so private companies started to experience debt crisis. While the Turkish lira was depreciating, the central bank was left without bullets, without enough reserves to intervene. And as it intervened, the reserves even depleted even further, which increased the panic even further. And a structure that Turkey still continued to give high current account deficits, which now is down because of the contraction in Turkish economy. There isn't enough economic activity, which is pulling the imports down. But the Turkish economy is still very much dependent on imported products. And whenever Turkish economy starts to recover, we will see a similar scenario. And of course, the depreciation of Turkish lira pushed the prices for producers. The increase in the price for producers was reflected in the consumer prices, and Turkey is therefore experiencing a significant increase in the inflation rate, as I shown in here. Well, what would be the outcome of these in incoming elections on Sunday? Turkey will have local elections on Sunday. What will be the outcome of it? Well, we have recently published one paper with my political scientist friend, Alper Yağcı, showing the impact of economic situation, economic growth, and on shaping the perceptions on how economy is doing, and how does that affect the growth in Turkey, and how could the media, especially pro-government media, play a role in changing this perceptions. But first of all, economic conditions in Turkey does matter in the elections. When Turkey went to the local elections 10 years ago in 2009, AKP basically experiences the most significant decline in its votes as a consequence of this economic downturn. But 2 years after, with the rapid recovery, AKP also achieved its highest vote share ever, which was almost 50%. So economic situation basically influences the voting behavior. There's one thing that I would like to show, is that the benefits of economic growth were actually shared by the whole population. So the boom, of course, we explained that the economic growth was highly enabled by the changing conditions in the world, and Turkey has its own potential for growth too, which could be like 4 or 5% already. And in the last 7 years, all the income groups experience growth. So this is a graph basically showing the growth of income for the 5% income groups. So the first one shows the income growth for the poorest 5%. The second column shows, the second point shows the second poorest 5% income growth. The third is showing the third poorest, and it goes on. This is the richest 5% income growth. And you could see that the benefits were shared by the whole population, and mainly it was shared by the poorest part, because in the Erdogan period we see significant increase in the minimum wages, more than the increase in the GDP per capita. Also there's an economic transformation from rural to urban sector, so that increased the incomes of the poorer population. And we see a significant increase in the richest top 5% incomes. The people who didn't benefit that much are the white collar, more educated, middle upper income people, which basically we could say that the Erdogan's voters are mainly here, less educated part. So in terms of political strategy, a shape like that is also quite beneficial for Erdogan, because Erdogan is not going for getting votes from the secular, well-educated part of the population. It's kind of like an elephant curve that the Serbian economist Branko Milanovic depicts for the world, that holds for Turkey too. But in latest years, the biggest benefits were actually going mainly for the richest 5%. So there's a significant change, which I think is due to the slightly rising inflation rate. And what we are predicting in our work is that the growth helps Tayyip Erdogan. So we basically predicted growth rates for each type of people that we are looking at using the Conda survey. Conda is a famous poll making company that was made in February 2018. And we predict like around 0.7 to 1% change happens when there's a 1% decline in the growth of incomes. And the growth rate between July 2017 to June 2018 was like 5.6%, and if we have a similar performance in the first quarter of 2019, a performance that's similar to last quarter of 2018, let's say, we can predict just roughly that the impact of this economic crisis will be around 4.2 to 6% in Erdogan's votes, which might change the election results, which might not change the election results. And this is what we see in the polls. Some polls now show the Social Democrat Party will win Istanbul. Some polls show Erdogan's party will win Istanbul. It's a similar situation for Ankara. A lot of the cities are just on the edge, and we'll see what will happen on Sunday. But Erdogan, we say, has one very strong tool, which is he controls media, a large part of the media. And some of the media is actually organically associated with Erdogan, which these newspapers, TV, Haber, Sabah, for instance. And I've shown some news from here. Here there's a news about subsidized sales of vegetables and fruits, and how this newspaper Sabah was showing people were happy with it. And here is one news saying, okay, the Social Democrats municipality is basically not making subsidized sales. Why? The questions being asked. So there's, of course, attacking the Social Democrat Party too, and giving the impression that if Erdogan goes, the other party will not fix what's going on in Turkey. Well, what we have done is that we grouped 4 media groups as pro-government. Of course, all the media groups here are under the influence of Erdogan government. But we have picked 4 media channels, A Haber, ATV, Kanal 7 and TRT, which is the public broadcasting channel, and all have like organic ties with Tayyip Erdogan. These 2 are basically have a CEO, and that's the brother of the current finance minister. This is public broadcasting channel. Kanal 7 has been always a channel that was associated with Erdogan's party from the beginning. And before the referendum in 2007, they were the channels that devoted the most time to Erdogan and AKP. So there's some sort of quantitative justification on this. At the time that we made the research, several channels, for instance, Kanal D, wasn't being sold to a new media group that we could also consider as pro-government. So the situation got worse after the survey was made.
It's Fox, from Fox International channel. I mean, they're known. Are they part? Why did you exclude them?
Because ironically, they're anti-government in Turkey. I know this might sound a bit funny to non-Turks, but what's happening is that of course, I mean, it's a channel that's associated with Republicans, conservative ideas in the United States, but in Turkey, that's precisely because Erdogan couldn't control Fox TV, because it's owned by Murdoch, which has close ties with the Republican Party, probably Trump in the United States. So if he basically tries to basically capture Fox News, that's something big that would also damage U.S.-Turkey relationships. So Fox is now, ironically, the most or the least conservative channel in Turkey that you could actually get some sort of news compared to other channels. And it's also shown in the data too. As you can see, it's actually the lowest time adopted to Erdogan and AKP was actually Fox News.
Which part of that was is CNN Turkey different to the CNN in America?
It's not, but now it's purchased by another. I mean, I think CNN International has shares in CNN Turkey, but the majority of at least there's some sort of franchise going on from CNN to CNN Turkey. But it was owned by Doğan Media Group, but now it's sold to Demirören Media Group, which actually started to act very aggressively pro-government. At the time that we made this research, it wasn't like that, so the situation was slightly better. But what we found is, okay, let me explain this table. We basically, there are different questions that are being asked. One is, or maybe if I show stick. One is, this basically question asks, okay, tell us how current government policies affect your own budget, and rate it from 5 to 1. And when we ask the question to past AKP voters and other voters, we see that those who are watching pro-government TV is basically giving better scores for government policies, saying that government policy affects our pocket better. The effect of current government's policies on the national economy, how is it ranked from 1 to 5? It's again, we see a significant difference in terms of pro-government TV, both for past AKP voters, for the others. And you might notice that people, on average, especially pro-government people, on average people who watch pro-government TVs, on average sees that the economy is doing better than their budget, which is also kind of like interesting that we will mention. About the future, how government policies affect your own budget, we again see higher scores for pro-government TV, and for the effects of government policies on national economy, we see higher scores for pro-government TV. If you take the average, okay, so sorry, these are the two. This is for your own pocket, and this is for your own, for the how the economy will perform. And if we look at from 1 to 3, say, okay, if AKP is replaced, what will happen? Will the economy do better, which be 1 point, or the economy will not change, which is 2 points, or the economy will do worse, which is 3 points. Again, there's a significant difference. So another effect of pro-government channels is basically showing that the change in the government will not improve the situation. And how is this being done? Well, there's a massive propaganda going on in these TV channels showing how possibly the economic situation would go worse if the government changes. Here is one example, for instance. You could see trash, garbage in the streets, scenes from Istanbul from early 90s, where the mayor was from the Social Democrat Party. And it was taken from a strike period. That's why the garbage was accumulating, but of course it's being used as a good material to reflect that, well, the Social Democrats are doing this to Istanbul. And this other thing is the main opposition party leader Kılıçdaroğlu was director of Social Security Organization at the 90s, and the pro-government channels basically consistently show scenes from the hospitals at the time in 90s to prove that, well, this guy, when he was director, he was messing up with our hospitals. And he's basically untalented in terms of governing. And if you elect this guy, the hospitals will be basically like this. That was the message that was given. And it's successful in terms of data. Well, this data is basically just descriptive statistics. When we run more complicated econometric analysis controlling for different identity factors and other factors, the results also don't change. There's a significant effect of watching pro-government media. And another thing that's interesting is that, for instance, when people are being asked to predict the inflation rates, the people who are watching pro-government media are actually telling lower interest rates, around like 8 to 7% lower inflation rates. So they think that the inflation rate is lower compared to the ones who are not watching this pro-government media channels. By the way, again, I have to say that the other channels are one way or the other affected by the government. I'm just like, when I say pro-government channels, it's like extremely pro-government channels that are working more like a propaganda machine. And the other thing that's interesting, just to finish this with an interesting talk, the pro-government TV followers also rate the current economic situation better than how they rate their budget. And I put like this little anecdote just as something a bit fun. So they basically interviewed two people. One is apparently pro-Erdogan person, and the other, his friend, is anti-Erdogan. And the guy is basically saying the economy is doing great. Everyone owns 3 cars. I mean, if you don't have any car, what can I do? And the other guy says, I mean, where's your car? I mean, you're talking about water bills, electricity bills, and you talk about car, and he basically lies. I have it, and the guy says, dude, I mean, I've known you for 40 years, you don't have even a bicycle. So that's actually the thing that we see too. I mean, the pro-government voters, pro-government people who watch pro-government TV channels, basically tend to rate the current economic situation better than how they rate their own budget. So even though they might be struggling with worsening economic situation, conditions of their own, they might say, well, the economy is doing fine. So this is just one thing that we also fund. Well, if you look at the numbers, basically the watching extreme pro-government media increased the probability of voting by 19 to 29%. So we could say that the extreme pro-TV channels like contribute Erdogan's vote between around 7 to 10% touch point, which is actually quite a lot. So there's a massive influence of media on shaping the economic understanding, and this was reflected in the voting behavior to Erdogan too. And after our research, as I said, a pro-government business group was purchased the biggest media company, Doğan Media Group, that was relatively associated with secular opposition, and immediately after that their editorial policy changed. And I think we are over time a bit. But to conclude, a couple of things. Well, Turkey has been experiencing economic downturn due to accumulating fragilities until now. And Turkey was giving current account deficits consistently, but that current account deficits were not reflected in terms of changing the economic structure in the way that it would close the current account deficits. And in the last 5 years, Turkey has been experiencing external debt increase and depleting foreign currency reserves, which is the main cause of the economic crisis that Turkey has been experiencing now. And the economic downturn is very likely to influence the voting behavior in local elections on Sunday. But still, Erdogan's control over the media may be his strongest asset to fight with recession, negative effects on him. Well, we'll see what will happen on Sunday, whether the real factors or the media will win at the end of this fight. Thank you.
I mean, this is really great. Thank you. You made so many things much more clear for us.
Thank you.
I'm sure we have so many questions and comments, but maybe first we should have some break. Maybe tea, coffee, and
A couple of minutes break.
like 5 minutes maximum. Yeah. So everyone. Okay, I think we can start now. We have about 40 minutes to discuss, to ask questions and to discuss the comment. So who would like to start? Yes, please.
Yeah.
The conclusion, can you help me to understand the correlation between the last two conclusions?
Last two conclusions.
Well, in your previous, one of your previous slides, you gave anecdotal.
Is this one or the previous one?
I'm just remembering in the previous one you gave anecdotal evidence that people are more concerned with the national economy than their own personal economy.
Okay.
I mean, keep to the conclusion. But you concluded that the economic downturn is very likely to influence the voting. As Turkey goes to the polls, Erdogan's control over the media may be his strongest asset. That's it. How do you correlate? Which one comes first? Because obviously it's not the economy that's influencing people; it's the media that's influencing people, isn't it? If they're more concerned with the national economy than their own. So why would you think accounting is likely and not technology, as it were, or Erdogan's use of media?
Should I take a couple of questions?
Okay, maybe a few more questions, and then you can answer them all together. Any more?
Or maybe I'll just answer this one
okay.
first. I'm talking about two contrasting effects. Well, this effect that's coming from media has always been there on shaping how the economy is doing. If the economy goes well, then there's an extra effect that's pushing Erdogan's votes even further. But when the economy is down, now we see an effect that's also pulling Erdogan's votes down, because the perception that the economic situation is doing better is partially changed due to the real conditions that's coming.
For the political, economic point, wouldn't you think those 2 points are contradictory?
No, they're just two contrasting effects. Like there's one effect that's positive for changing the economic perception of voters, and there's another effect that's
Okay.
changing the economic perception on the other direction. So,
Okay.
And
It's not-
can I add something? I mean, if I understand you correctly, I think these two factors are together affecting the behavior of the electorate. The one factor potentially affecting them to move away from the government, but at the same time, government, by controlling almost all media, counterbalancing this, creating a false impression. So therefore, these two again goes hand in hand. The last factor is the government's biggest weapon, or biggest gun, to reduce the impact, negative impact of the economic downturn.
Right.
So, I mean, this is what I
yeah,
understand.
yeah. You explained it quite well. Thank you. It's exactly what it is. What I'm saying is that if there wasn't, let's say, extreme pro-government media, maybe in these elections, because of the economic crisis, we could have seen Social Democrat Party winning the main cities, Istanbul and Ankara, much more easily, and now we don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen on Sunday. The poll companies basically say it's very tight now, at least in Istanbul and Ankara. Yeah.
Could you come back to that curve?
Elephant
Curve between, yeah, and the other one.
Yeah, this
right
one.
after,
Yeah.
Now, this shows very clearly that the poorest, let's say 20%, will be his followers because their economy is getting better in a way. And the top 10%, their incomes are increasing, they are doing good business, so they will not oppose him. They may not support him, but they will not oppose him because they are doing. We know from the previous statistics that, for example, Arçelik had their most profitable period under this government. So why should Arçelik oppose his policies? So this actually gives a lot of explanation to many things in political life. Why the middle classes, secular middle classes who thought that they owned the state before, they are very, very, how do you say, disappointed with the government. Whereas the other 5 to 20% poorest people are supporting because they have gained a lot. Don't you think so?
No, it's I think strategically important for Erdogan too. There are a couple of reasons for this graph. First of all, one is Erdogan's strategy is increasing the minimum wages more than GDP per capita. That's one, and increasing the social transfers going through to poorer parts of the population. However, Erdogan, since he's not coming from a leftist background, is actually quite opposing the labor movements. So the organized blue-collar workers that actually might be here don't have a very strong bargaining power against capitalists, and that's precisely because of the view of Erdogan in terms of, and he is also implementing policies that are actually, at least until the last few years, that he was implementing policies that could be easily considered as neoliberal, meaning that very much opening up the financial markets, going for privatization, still going for privatizations.
Fewer regulations.
Fewer regulations, exactly. Which basically is, I think, one of the prime reasons behind this, or this for longer run periods. And strategically, it's also true a good strategy for himself, because, for instance, if this part, let's say teachers, lawyers, or more secular part of the population was earning a significant rise in their incomes, still they wouldn't have voted for Erdogan. At least a part of it. I mean, just think yourself, if your economic situation was improving, but with all these people that are going to prison, deteriorating education system, deteriorating rule of justice, law, would you vote for Erdogan? Probably not. But the conservative population that also already is sympathizing with Erdogan has a tendency to vote for Erdogan, and you have to give something to them to keep them voting for Erdogan if they weren't benefiting from it. And there are very interesting graphs. Of course, this part of the thing is due to the changing economy. I mean, of course, there's a growth potential of Turkey. Let's put it. And in 2006, 1 out of 3 people could eat meat once or twice a week. And now the statistic is 2 out of 3 people. So 1 out of 3 people were eating meat, could afford to eat meat 10 years ago, and now it's 2. And of course, contributed Erdogan's votes. This is from a statistic from 2016. By the way, one interesting point is that similarly, that's very interesting, Brazil has a similar graph too, and indeed Lula was also, and Lula Dilma, the Social Democrats leaders, were also getting votes from the poorer population. And for Bolsonaro, of course, the new president got votes from everyone, but he actually got more votes from the upper middle classes that benefited less from the growth in Brazil. And in terms of the voting behavior of this 5%, probably most of this rise is coming due to the 1%, and I mean, that doesn't matter really. In terms of income share, 1% or 5% is important, but in terms of their voting share, they're just 5%. Yeah, so it doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, you explained the period very well. I mean, I'm really convinced. You explained the turning points from 2002 up to the end of 2018, and each period, what economic policies were followed, and how the fortunes changed from one to the other. I think you made it really, really clear, and I'm really glad. But I try to put this in a global picture, because I look at the emerging or rising powers from beginning of 20th century, beginning of 21st century onwards, and I try to compare this with other similar emerging economies, middle kind of, maybe not South Korea, because South Korea I think is much more stable comparing with Turkey, but South Africa or Mexico. For instance, when quantitative easing came to an end, I think in late 2017, and quantitative tightening, if you can call it, started to affect the American financial policies, and this made a huge negative impact on a number of emerging economies, because the interest rates and the borrowing conditions change significantly, and you, as you explained very clearly, because bulk of the growth in this last period was based on borrowing low interest money. So how can you compare this? If you compare Turkey with, let's say, Mexico, can we compare it, and can we have the same conclusions, or the internal domestic conditions in Turkey made much more, created a different picture?
Okay, I think here I should categorize the emerging powers into maybe 4 categories, or at least like in terms of 2 different dimensions. One is whether the economy is natural resource rich or not. The natural resource rich ones could be South Africa, Brazil, also benefited from the rising commodity prices, which didn't happen in Turkey. So that's one thing that Turkey is missing. Which of course, from my perspective, I think not being a natural resource rich country is a big fortune for Turkey's long-run economic development, but that's another discussion. So, of course, the countries that are natural resource rich were damaged from decline in the commodity prices. One example is, it's not very comparable with Turkey because it has a totally different economic structure, but Venezuela, for instance. At the time of Chavez, there was a commodity boom. Chavez benefited from this commodity boom, but I think he didn't do enough to restructure the industry so that the country would become less dependent on the natural resource exports, and now they're experiencing significant problems. The other dimension is that how much your economy is open to capital inflows, how much it's not. In terms of that, for instance, countries like Argentina was following a much closed model. Brazil and Indonesia were relatively close, and Turkey was on the end, actually that's the more liberal side, indeed one of the most liberal countries in terms of capital inflows. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why when the crisis happened in 2008, it's damaged Turkey more than other upper middle or lower middle income countries. And you could also see that the boom periods were better for Turkey too than other countries. So the volatility of growth has been larger in Turkey because of Turkey being more open to the capital flows, I think. Well, of course, in the latest years, Turkey has been separating from some other economies because of the increasing concerns on deterioration of democracy and rule of law, and also deteriorating relationships with the United States, which is also another concern that financial markets could have, which is generating different problems. But one thing that's interesting is that the economy that's, for instance, Argentina, that used to be much more close, much more state-oriented economy at the time of Kirchner's, now with Macri, has liberalized. They even are planning to pay part of the IMF debts that they haven't paid after the 2000 crisis, and they are basically being the good child of the world, of the financial markets. And Argentina isn't a country that's experienced democratization problems like us, but still Argentina also has been experiencing important problems in terms of its economy. Because this liberalization period basically happened, so you start to see the problems of that. That's part of it. But in terms of Turkey, of course, I could add more things to Turkey, which is there's a deteriorating education system, there's a deteriorating rule of law, there's a deteriorating democracy, which might not be felt immediately, but would definitely affect the long-run potential growth in Turkey, I have to say.
Is productivity declining as well?
Manufacturing, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be worthwhile looking. Now, it's with the negative growth, it should be, but again, what I'm saying, the impact of education or rule of law is something that we would see in the very long run, like in you have to look at the 5-year moving averages to see what's happening.
Thank you. Anybody else?
My question is that because of the most of the economists which we hear from TV or reading from newspapers is definitely they say there is a crisis, Turkey economy is in crisis. This is the fact. Nobody except AKP government deny it. And also its expectation and also direction of the crisis is will increase, most of them says. And what is the actually Turkey banking system at this stage of the crisis, economic crisis? Because the it is the like another level of the crisis in one country if it reflects to banking or finance system, and which is more deepen it will increase the crisis. What is the banking or finance sectors at the moment in point of view? And also for near future, this crisis, economical crisis, will go which direction, you think, or any data about it?
Also worsening relations with NATO and America can be another important impact in the near future because of the S-400s, both from Russia and relation with Russia is Erdogan playing certain cards in the political poker. That I think in the near future they will bring very interesting developments, and this will be terrible for the, people with democratic opinions and socialist opinions. And now he said they are building 193 new prisons in Turkey.
And before you answer, I can ask one point related to this one. Maybe you can comment on three of us together. In relation to, I think you mentioned earlier, Chinese One Belt One Road initiative, and Turkey already is one of the signatories, and some of the projects already started with Chinese investment and engineering in Turkey. And Turkey is now, I think, observer member of Shanghai Cooperative Organization, and there is a possibility of Turkey will become a member like Iran and Pakistan and India in near future. So in relation to Turkey's changing the direction of it is not only economy but security and ideological orientation as well towards much more authoritarian and less democratic regimes. So all these, do you think, will also make an impact in terms of Turkey's near future economic development, or maybe they will find some way of coming out of this crisis if they have got this new direction or investment?
Okay, I think I want to answer these questions. In terms of the banking system, as I've shown in this graph, obviously the situation in the private sector has been realized by the Turkish banks too, because of these private companies being lent to Turkish banks. And as I said, like for instance, whenever the Turkish crisis appeared, the chairman of BNP Paribas came to Turkey because they also have some shares in the Turkish banks too. Well, since they know the situation of the real sector now, and there's a sequence of companies that's declaring bankruptcy, the credits that are given to the private sector has declined significantly, and it didn't recover yet. So yes, the banks are being super cautious now while providing credits, which is one of the reasons why the economic recession is ongoing, I think. But if the economic situation goes worse, if we see an even further sequence of banks going into bankruptcy, yes, we could see this real sector crisis being transmitted to the banking sector too, which might deepen the crisis even further. In terms of the near future, I think we might not have seen the worst of what happened. Because here, for instance, if you look at the 2001 crisis, or 1994, 1994 crisis, there's a decline in the external debt stock after the crisis. That's happening slowly. But currently, now the gross external debt is increasing. Of course, one advantage that we have is current account deficit significantly declined now. But still, the external debt is increasing. And maybe in the near future we could see scenarios of like temporarily recovering, generating some further economic activity, and the external debt accumulating even further, which might lead to another crisis. So we could see kind of like a, what would you say, like
Periodic crisis.
yeah, W shape maybe crisis. That's a possibility, because I feel like Turkey's fragilities now are still there. As you can see, I mean, the level of external debt is similar to the levels of 2001, and the reserves are still at very low levels, which is one of the reasons why there's a panic that's ongoing. So maybe there might be a V-shape, or maybe we could have a longer period recession that's ongoing.
And what the Europeans bailed them out because of their own problems with Brexit and their own economic needs as well.
Bail who?
Bail Turkey out.
In what form do you have on your mind?
Oh, well, because of, well, it's all a combination of different factors. Because of the security problems in the Middle East, the economic expansion of China, the problem.
No, but I mean, how, in what format, like they would bail Turkey? Like, I mean, go
Exactly.
like.
I mean,
Turkey
by
credit
giving them more, well, I'm not an economist, so,
Lending money.
yeah,
Is
lending
it what
money,
you said?
you know, lending money to, I don't know, shore up their economy or something. I don't know, I'm not an economist, so. I don't know.
Maybe Turkey could go to IMF, for instance.
That's all, yeah.
But the problem with IMF is the following, in terms of the perspective of Erdogan. If you go to IMF, you have to follow IMF's policies, which isn't very Erdogan. Because they will give you a standby agreement, say that, okay, these are the list of policies that you have to apply. And some of these policies are not very good in terms of his populist views. And as a character, he's not somebody that likes to be led by some foreign bureaucrats too. So yes, I mean, but at some point, of course, if Turkey's debt crisis deepens, Turkey might have to go to IMF and get that standby agreements, which I would personally oppose and hope that it won't happen, because when we look at the history of IMF, the countries that basically make these agreements with IMF, I mean, all the IMF agreements are extremely pro-capital, going with like super austerity policies, and the last one is what happened in Greece. Well, and the consequences, the social consequences of them are a lot of times not very pleasant. Not generalizing, but this is usually the case. But if Turkey has to go, they might end up by going. In terms of other alternatives, NATO, Okay, I mean the relations with NATO and US and EU, how I see this, I'm not a political scientist, but how I see this is the following. These relationships between countries has a long history. So they are not like disappearing like that, or they are not improving like that. What both US and EU has been playing with Turkey is basically, I mean, giving warnings, going one step forward, going one step backward, was somehow like threatening Turkey, but not cutting the connection with Turkey entirely. I have to remind you that besides everything, Turkey is still a candidate for EU membership, still. Although in the near future that might end, but no, because the European Parliament basically made an advisory decision to end the candidacy process. But, so it's not 1 or 0 in terms of US or EU relationships. The other alternatives like China or Shanghai Pact, well, there are a couple of problems with relying entirely on them. One of the problems is that Turkey's exports are mainly oriented European Union. And we have nothing to export to China, for instance. The things that we are exporting to China are stuff like marble, very small amount of things. And once we make larger amounts of trade with China, that means that we are giving larger amounts of trade deficits, current account deficits with China. Well, of course, we are not in plus in terms of current account deficits with EU, but we get like more capital goods maybe. With China, that might end up with flow of cheap consumer goods, which we definitely wouldn't want. So that alternative is, I would put a question mark to that, because you don't, and the other countries, like for instance, that are in Shanghai Pact, they are really, really small. I mean, what are you going to, how much trade are you going to do with Tajikistan, for instance? Really, I mean, the two countries there that are important, Russia and China, and Russia, you're already like doing trade, you're very much giving current account deficit due to the natural resources that you're importing.
And now India, Iran, Pakistan.
True, but the size of these economies, okay, India is big, you're right. But what are you going to sell? I mean, what's your comparative advantage?
No, I agree with you.
Yeah,
because it's a dependency, the pact. I mean, China, if Turkey enters into that role, Turkey will be a heavily dependent country, selling maybe workforce, which some Chinese investment may come to Turkey, but Turkey at the end of the day will stop selling its high-tech items because China doesn't need them, or China produces them better. I mean,
and it will damage Europe because they can produce the cheaper products much cheaper than you.
Exactly.
I mean, their labor power is much cheaper. So I don't see that as a sustainable.
Same is true for India as well.
The same is true for India as well.
Exactly. So if Turkey enters into that role, I agree with you. Turkey will be one of those smaller dependent countries, which at the moment Turkey is higher than that. You're right, in terms of economy.
And if you're a Chinese investor also, if you would invest on the Turkish, I mean, you would, for instance, bring high-tech, let's say, technology or make factories, if you have a reason to do that. I mean, why would, for instance, China or Chinese companies set up factories in Turkey while Turkey was being excluded from Western Europe? What might be the reason for that? There isn't cheap labor in Turkey. If the markets with Europe are closed, there's no point on like using Turkey as a base to export products to Europe. I'm not saying that we should be entirely European-oriented or US-oriented in terms of politics or economy. It's always good to diversify your options. For instance, one of the things that AKP has done is increasing the trade with African countries, for instance. I think that's an important important step that a lot of the governments have ignored for a long while. But again, like the size of African economies are extremely small compared to European Union. They're poor countries. You can't just say, okay, I'm just like replacing Africa, China, and India with European Union and United States. European Union. I mean.
You wouldn't like the jump ship to another ship.
I think that Turkey wouldn't benefit from. Of course, it's good to diversify your options to reduce your dependency on Europe. But
Any other questions or comments?
Benim Türkçe sordum ama.
tabii, of course.
Evet, çevirsin. Bu çalışmada savaş ekonomisi eksik.
Hı hı.
Yani çünkü Türkiye'deki rakamsal veriler, grafikler yapısındaki özelleştirme var orada örneğin. Oysa Türkiye'ye giren para, savaş nedeniyle giren paranın hepsi iktidarın bir şekilde ekonomik şeyine yatırıldı, ekonomik enstitüsüne yatırıldı. Bu nedenle ben Orta Doğu gerçekliği nedeniyle daha çok savaş ekonomisinin yarattığı bir güç nedeniyle bu yani bu çalışmanız grafiker veya rakamların oradaki pek karşılığı yok. Şunu anlatmaya çalışıyorum. Birinci sorun şu. Daha çok soruya gelince. Savaş ekonomisi burada yok. Yani özelleştirme dair olarak bir sürü şey rakamlar var ama oysa savaşa bağlı olarak Türkiye'ye girenlerin buradaki özelleştirme denen rakamların çok üzerinde bir para.
Peki savaş derken yani hangi savaş?
Avrupa Birliği'nin yok, Suriye nedeniyle, Suriye Savaşı nedeniyle Türkiye'ye giren paradan bahsediyorum. Türkiye'ye giren. Bu Türkiye'ye giren para bu çalışmada yok. Oysa AKP'nin gücünün, AKP'nin en büyük gücünün savaş ekonomisinden geldiğini inanıyorum. Orada en büyük gazetecilik yaptım. Buradaki en büyük eksiklik savaş algısındaki Orta Doğu gerçekliği. Savaş algısındaki bir ekonomik eksiklik var. Şimdi güçlü bir iktidar bekliyor dünya. Çünkü savaşı Orta Doğu'ya sıkıştırmak niyetinde tüm dünya. Peki burada güçlü bir lider kim olabilir? Güçlü lider dediğim Erdoğan olacak. Erdoğan yaratıyor. Şimdi ilkinde bir savaş ekonomisi nedeniyle bir istatistik verilerin olması gerekiyor bu işte bence. Çünkü ekonomi oradaki ayakta tutan bir de şey oldu. En büyük algı o. İkincisi de bu yaratılan, medya üzerinde yaratılan bir sosyolojik ve psikolojik değerler anlattınız. Bu sadece medyanın yarattığı veya medyanın onu rahatlattığı bir durum sadece bir ayağı bu. Ekonomik tarafı karşılığının bulamamasının nedeni bu dönem oranın yaşadığı bir özel koşul, savaş koşullarının yaşadığı bir değer var burada. O nedenle bu tür...
Yani Suriye sınırındaki...
Tabii Türkiye. Düşün, bir ülke düşün. Bu ülke hiçbir komşuyla anlaşamıyor. Tek anlaştığı Kürdistan. O da tanımıyor. Başka kimseyle anlaşamıyor.
So, perhaps you can summarize this question for,
I
for those...
mean, the question is basically asking what's the role of the war economy in this whole story, and how, like the, if I understand correctly, like it's how and there's a critique saying that the war economy is missing in this whole story. There are a couple of things about war economy, so that I could talk about. It's a very broad thing, but let me try to give a few things. One part of this war economy is immigrants coming, for instance. That might be important in this story from Syria, because Turkey has taken 3 million immigrants from Syria, and these immigrants brought their wealth too, which actually generated economic activity, which we have to take into account. I'll get to the other points too, but I just wanted to start because this is very much ignored, and it created these people that came to those cities like Gaziantep, Kilis, where they generated an economy. There's of course negative things about them for the people living there, like raising the rents. They are seen as like competitors in the labor markets. But the research shows the overall effect is that people's conditions haven't been damaged that much by the Syrian immigrants. In terms of the trade that's being made with those countries, like Syria, for instance, there's definitely a negative impact of that in terms of I have to look at the data, but it will be too surprising to see that the trade with Syria has collapsed in the latest years. But at the same time, there's some sort of economy that's going on due to the war activities. That can be activities of the Turkish army or produce new weapons, which Erdogan is trying to make it more and more locally made with new Turkish companies set up. I mean, honestly, I haven't looked at the data how much these contribute to the Turkish economy. But we have to recognize that in terms of for instance, war economy, in terms of the weapons that are being used in all those areas for improving Erdogan's hegemony, Turkey is still very much dependent on the weapons that are imported. So on one hand, it's generating extra economic activities, on the other hand, it's generating extra imports, which is one of the causes of the current account deficit that we are giving. Because all these like missiles, tanks, they're super expensive material.
This one?
Yeah, I think my friend has also tried to mention kara para, the black money, which is not registered, recorded anywhere at all. For example, at the beginning of the Syrian war, Turkey was like a subcontractor for Saudis, Qataris, United Arab Emirates. So they acted on behalf of them. So hundreds of millions of dollars have poured into this subcontracted business of war. So these are not registered, they are not shown anywhere. And lots of people have benefited from that. Later, it's a different story, but it is a known secret that...
Yeah, I see your point, I see your point.
You see?
But
It all depends though on Erdogan's foreign policy though. I mean, this war economy, is it symbolic of his foreign policy, or what's his strategic goal for his tenure? Is he looking to a military strategy or looking to an economic strategy to cement his own power within Turkey?
I think it's both, right? I mean, you can't have military strategy sustainable without a sustainable economic strategy. So he needs to have both to keep his hegemony, I would say. I mean, in terms of the war economy, like that are unregistered, again, like I can say a lot of things, but it's the hardest thing to talk about is unregistered stuff, because by definition you don't keep the statistics of it. So it's hard to see what's the overall impact. So that's why maybe academics a bit like stay away from speaking, at least like unless you have the, because you know,
it's more journalism.
Yeah, it's more, maybe more journalism. Maybe it's a task of journalists more. It's hard to tell because again, like all these like military activities generate some economy in the domestic firms. There might be leading to some money flow to some legal or illegal organizations, but at the same time, again, what I'm saying is that the weapons that are being used in these wars, or weapons that are going to Syria, are mainly not produced in Turkey. I mean, if somehow Turkey is becoming a hub for importing Kalashnikovs to the Islamist groups in Syria, for instance, yeah, but we have to buy the Kalashnikovs from somewhere else. Maybe we could get a premium on like import of these, because these are risky activities, obviously. And the numbers is really hard to tell how much it contributes. So I would be cautious about talking about it.
I have one question which I mentioned during the break. Turkey has auto industry, which is very, very important.
Car manufacturing.
Car manufacturing, not mainly car manufacturing, but mostly car spare parts manufacturing.
Yes.
Secondary industries, which the market is Europe, England, Germany, and so on. So this crisis with the Americans on foreign policies have destroyed Turkish lira in September, November. But since that time, we know that the car production, car parts production contracted in big percentages. So that meant that although they imported less, they exported also less. So after the elections, or after all that dust settled down, what could we expect in the manufacturing industry, given the conditions?
First of all, let me tell one thing. The contraction of automobile industry is mainly due to the domestic market rather than exports. Of course, European Union is having its own problems, which is not helping Turkish exports much, but there's a significant decline in the car sales in Turkey in the last couple of months, and this is happening even though there are tax cuts to subsidize the car sales. In terms of the future of Turkish manufacturing, unless we make some significant structural changes in our economic model, we'll see the same story that I explained here over and over again. Again, let's say that there's positive economic growth next year. Somehow there's changes in the policies of central banks, so all of a sudden capital started to flow to Turkey. Well, the outcome of that is, yes, Turkish economy will continue growing, but since the automobile production is very much dependent on the intermediate goods coming from other countries, and the value added that Turkey generates is relatively low, the improvement in the growth rates will be immediately reflected on the
So that's because
current economic deficit.
that's because you don't pay tariffs on domestic products, right? Because you only pay tariffs on exports, don't you?
No, I mean, that's because it's not about the tariff strategy. You can change the story by the tariff strategy if you put tariffs to the intermediate goods, but that of course has to be done very carefully, because if you put tariffs on the intermediate goods, then you might end up by producing the same product with much higher prices.
As I understand
But-
it, sorry, domestic products are cheaper, right? Because you're making them inside the country itself. You don't have to pay. It's different to. You don't have to pay like stuff that is.
No. I mean, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that
Okay.
for the exported products. For services, it's of course
yes.
cheaper, but it's a different story. Because you don't. I mean, this is not a very closed economy. That's why. So Sorry, what was the question? I was just...
Domestic products.
Domestic
Will
products.
there be no tariffs?
Well, yeah, I mean, the domestic yeah, let's return back to the question. Like, in terms of the industrial structure, like, we would see a similar story. There's one thing that we will see the effects, which is the new national car project of Tayyip Erdogan, which was, I guess, around $1 billion. Electric car. But we'll see the outcome of it, how it's being made. But just to conclude, I think you want to finish. So, things that I should say before concluding. I think if you want to have a sustainable growth in the future, we have to somehow convert our industrial production structure. And this could be done by, one, improving the human capital, improving the education system, which unfortunately we are moving on the opposite direction. Of course, we have to have proper rule of law, proper justice system, proper democratic system. And we have to have some sort of planning that would enable the development of different industries, and this planning could go with either giving subsidies to the selected industries or the state at some point intervening and making the investments itself. I think with this like model that's highly dependent on capital inflows, highly dependent on financial flows, and slash the construction sector, we will see the same stories over and over again, and it will just go worse as the world conjuncture is changing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This was